And what we saw yesterday was the actions of a desperate, third-term, arrogant Premier. What we saw yesterday was an opportunistic play by the Premier to look like she's doing something and acting on youth crime in Queensland. The Deputy Premier confirmed it in a press conference only half an hour ago, where he said, "We saw an opportunity." And I think he realised once he said that he got the words wrong. But that's how they operate. This Palaszczuk government operate looking for political opportunities. The Premier was on holidays. She came back for a day, realising that this issue was becoming quite a big issue in terms of youth crime in Queensland. So the Premier comes in for a day, announces a rafter package, jets out again back on a holiday, and then leaves it for the Deputy Premier this morning, who confirmed what we all knew, that it was only because of an opportunistic plight that arrived yesterday that gave the Premier an opportunity to make a big grand announcement to appease people that she looks like she's doing something on youth crime. That is how the Premier operates. It was only a year ago, nearly to the day, 28th of January, the Premier stood in this very place and criticised judges about youth justice. Fast forward 1 year and she's doing exactly the same thing, and announced a few changes to the Youth Justice Act, which Tim Nicholls, our Shadow Attorney-General, will get to in a minute. This is a Premier who again yesterday blamed everyone but herself. Blamed the courts, blamed everyone but herself or her ministers. The Deputy Premier, I just watched with interest his press conference. The Deputy Premier said that they'd been working on this plan for months. That is absolute rubbish. This plan has been clearly concocted in the Premier's media unit in the last 48 hours. Mark Ryan himself defended the laws they had only 48 hours ago, all for the Premier 24 hours later to announce a raft of changes that they had concocted overnight. And again, why? They concocted a raft of changes because a political opportunity presented itself to the Premier and she took it. Everyone in Queensland knows youth crime has been an issue for years. The Leader of the Opposition, David Crisafulli, has been calling the government out on it for years. The LNP entire team has been calling it out. The community has been calling it out. We have seen tragic event after tragic event. We've seen deaths. We've seen people's homes being broken into, cars being stolen. And the government just keep saying they're doing everything they can to address the issues of youth crime. Everyone knew it was an issue. The government, the Palaszczuk government, was not listening to our community. I want to set the scene now of what has happened here and why we have the issues of youth crime that we have in 2022 and why the Premier had to do what she did yesterday. This is a series of press announcements this government has released over the last 8 years. Headline after headline. Youth crime, new task forces, new coordinators, new ways of dealing with it. It's like they wake up every morning realising it's an issue and then have to issue another press release to give the appearance they're doing something. Clearly, what they've been doing hasn't worked, and I'll explain why it hasn't worked. First off, we had the very first bill the Palaszczuk government introduced into this parliament nearly 8 years ago in 2015 was the Youth Justice Amendment Bill. Now, what this bill did is it deleted and got rid of many of the reforms previous LNP governments had made to tackle the issues of youth crime. You look at the explanatory notes, and who was the Attorney-General at the time? Well, the embattled Health Minister, Yvette D'Arth, so it doesn't surprise anyone. You look at what she put in her explanatory notes. This is Anastasia's Attorney-General D'Arth at the time. That bill in 2015 prohibited journalists, media, the community from identifying information about children who were dealt with in the youth justice courts. It removed breach of bail as an offence. There it is, in black and white, yellow highlight. Breach of bail was deleted in 2015. It was repealed under Palaszczuk's own legislation. Reinstate the principle that detention order should be imposed only as a last resort and for the shortest period of time when sentencing a child. And finally, reinstate the Penalties and Sentences Act, the principle that imprisonment is a sentence of last resort and a sentence that allows an offender to stay in the community is preferable. That was in 2015, the very first legislation the Palaszczuk government introduced in 2015. Then in 2016, they introduced another Youth Justice Amendment Bill, and this one was amendment for the 17-year-old persons. This is where they said that 17-year-olds will no longer be treated as adults who are committing adult crime. They will be treated as kids under the Youth Justice Act. The Attorney-General's own explanatory notes at the time increased the upper age of who is a child for the purposes of the Youth Justice Act from 16 to 17 years. So that means that all the 17-year-olds committing these heinous crimes that we have seen, allegedly in the Ledbetter case and in the case we've seen more recently, alleged 17-year-olds committing murder, will now be treated as kids under the Youth Justice Act, not as adults as they previously were. Again, Anastasia Palaszczuk's own legislation. Not the LNPs, not the communities, not crossbenchers, Labor's own legislation. Then in 2016 it continues. The weakening of the youth justice system started in 2015. The weakening of youth justice laws started when Anastasia Palaszczuk was elected Premier of this state. And we have seen the youth crime crisis spiral because they have weakened all the laws. And in 2016 we had the laws where they closed all the magistrates' courts to hearings of youth justice matters. So keeping people in the dark, keeping media in the dark of what these young criminals are getting up to. Is it any wonder we have seen the spike we have seen over the years in the youth justice system? We also saw the Premier yesterday blaming the judges. But as the Shadow Attorney-General will soon allude to, as I've indicated in their legislation, they put in their legislation detention as a last resort. So when a magistrate or a judge has a young offender before their court, the government, through the government's legislation, is telling that judge and magistrate that detention should be a last resort. In other words, the child should be back in the community, back on the streets, not in jail. The judges are abiding by the law the Palaszczuk government has given them. It is the Labor government's law that the magistrates are implementing at the moment. So unless there's changes in those laws, in terms of the sentencing principles that a judge looks at, then nothing will change. In 2016, on top of all these laws, the government announced a 5-point plan. In 2019, tackling youth crime, they announced a 4-point plan. In 2020, they announced another 5-point plan. And in 2022, we've now got a 9-point plan to tackle the issues of youth crime. So we've gone from a 5-point plan, a 4-point plan, a 5-point plan, now to a 9-point plan. We've had a Department of Youth Justice that Bob G was put in charge of. That's now abolished. We've had task force after task force. We've had blitz after blitz, coordinator after coordinator, minister after minister. The main point they have missed in all of this is breach of bail. Why on earth did the Premier not take the opportunity yesterday to reintroduce or announce reintroduction of breach of bail as an offence? The one thing the community are saying will work, the one thing the community are calling for, there are petitions for it. There's been motions in Parliament about breach of bail, and the Premier refused to be drawn on that issue yesterday. This is a failure of leadership. It is a failure of legislation. That's what we've seen over the last 8 years. And I'd say to the Premier, is she going to apologise to Queenslanders? Seriously, I don't know how the Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk, sleeps at night, knowing that the youth justice crisis in Queensland started when she started weakening the laws in 2015. There is no one else to blame but the Palaszczuk government. No one else to blame but the Palaszczuk government for the youth crime crisis. And what we have seen is all these knee-jerk reactions to get it out of the media attention for 24 hours. Huge issue, a violent home invasion, a murder in Queensland. Premier jumps up within 48 hours announcing a raft of changes, and nothing changes because the changes they made in 2015 and beyond, weakening, going soft on our laws, going soft on young criminals, had led to where we are today.